Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello and welcome to Soft Cover, ThePrint's online platform for the launch of selected non-fiction books. I'm Snesh Alex Philip. What does strike you when somebody mentions the First World War? Of course, it is the Great Britain, it is France, it is Germany. But if someone tells you the Indian contribution to the First World War, the immediate things that come to our mind is, of course, the Indian soldiers, the great expeditionary force that the British Army was, and how the Indians played a very critical role in the First World War. However, we now have a book which now details a different aspect of India's contribution to the World War I. I'm talking about the book, The Coolies' Great War, Indian Labor in a Global Conflict, 1914 to 1921, published by the HarperCollins and authored by Radhika Singha. Radhika Singha is a professor of modern history at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and her research interests focus on the social history of crime and criminal law, among others. So before I carry forward this conversation, we will unveil this book here. Well, there you go. This is the book that we will be talking about today. Radhika Singha's The Coolies' Great War, Indian Labor in a Global Conflict, 1914 to 1921, published by, of course, the HarperCollins. Welcome to the Soft Cover, ma'am.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak about my book on your platform today.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, I must tell you, this book has been an eye-opener for me. I cover defense and security issues. I write on them. I've written about the India's military contribution to the World War I. But this book really brings out a different aspect that many of us never really thought about or never really researched into. So, when you mentioned this, the Coolies' Great War, who are the coolies?
I use the word coolies because that was the racist term used for labor at the lowest rung of the global labor market. Labor which was presumed to be unskilled, presumed to be infinitely replaceable. And I'm using coolie here as a category for all the non-combatant ranks of the Indian Army, who were a very, very diverse lot. Of course, there were construction workers, but there were also regimental servants, transport workers like the mule drivers, the stretcher bearer corps, the ones who carried the wounded away from the battlefield, dock workers. So I've put them all under the category coolie or menial. In military terminology, they would be known as followers at that time.
Ma'am, you start this book with the fact that this book actually stems from an article that you penned in 2004. At that time, there was this talk of, possibly India sending its troops to Iraq. Now, what was the article then, and how did, it's a journey of 16 years, if I'm not mistaken. So how did that happen, ma'am?
I write at bullet cart pace, but in 2004, I hadn't thought really of a book. But many of us were very upset in 2003 and 2004 at the idea that we should send an Indian contingent to Iraq. So in search of that story, like all ineffectual people, or all ineffectual historians, I went to the archives to go back and discover the story of another occasion when an Indian expeditionary force had sailed into the Persian Gulf, that is to Mesopotamia, current-day Iraq. Now, Snehesh, when you began your talk, you said in our minds, India in World War I is associated with Britain, Germany, France. And that's true because there was so much of a public investment in the French theater of war. But in fact, the largest number of Indians, of course, as you know, went to Iraq. We sent some 6 lakh people to Iraq, of whom actually a full half were not soldiers. They were actually construction workers, dock laborers, etc. So it's at that point that I went back to the archives, and to my surprise, I found this flurry of letters asking frantically for latrine sweepers from India. Now, that was okay. You need latrine sweepers, cleaners everywhere. But what took me aback was, why was this correspondence confidential? What was so confidential about asking for sweepers? And then I realized that actually these poor men were going to be sent into the thick of a cholera epidemic. And obviously, they were going to be what we call, epidemic warriors in a sense. And hence, the need to keep this entire correspondence confidential, because they were not going to be told about the situation they were being sent into.
And this book also mentions that, which I also completely agree, is the fact that in the official literature on India's contribution to the Great War, these others are not mentioned. I'm talking about construction workers, mule drivers, porters, sweepers, dhobis for that matter. Despite the fact that they've played such a critical role, some way has our own history, ignored these people completely. The non-combatants who played a very important role and who've lost many lives.
Actually, there were reasons both for the Indian educated classes at that time to allow these humble figures to blur into the valorous figure of the Gurkha or the Sikh. And that was because the word coolie was a racial category and Indians, in South Africa, etc. You had coolie lawyers or coolie, barristers. So coolie was not something that they wished to associate India or Indian identity with. So, they were quite happy to let this 500,000 people blur into the 1.4 overall million, which India contributed to the war. Now, the government of India, on its part, was also willing to let the coolie blur into the figure of the soldier, because what was happening in India at that time during the war was a full-scale campaign to end the system of indentured labor to the sugar plantations of empire. So they also were not very keen to highlight the fact that once again, labor was being sent out from India, not to sugar plantations, of course, but in the military stream. So they were quite happy to give a military frame to labor, so that labor was obscured.
This is interesting that you mentioned, and the book mentions that this is something that I didn't know. For example, out of the 1.4 million Indian recruiters to World War I, 5,63,369 were followers on non-combatants.
Nahesh, this one correction, it's not 5 lakhs, it's 500,000. Out of 1.4 million, 500,000 are non-combatants. And in fact, in overseas theatre, because this 1.4 represents also Indians who are fighting on the northwestern frontier, etc. Now, when we look at the expeditionary forces which went overseas, we find that the proportion of non-combatants to combatants is sometimes almost like equal. So it's very big. It's a very huge figure. It's 500,000.
This book also brings in this concept that was prevalent there at that time, which was the coolie core. However, it was not regarded as part of the military establishment. So did that change a lot of dynamics in terms of payments to the Indians, in terms of the facilities that were offered?
That's a very good question. That is, when actually right from the early 20th century, you had virtually full-time standing coolie units on India's northeastern frontier. For example, in Sadia, it was the Assam side, and of course, all along the northwestern frontier. Otherwise, who was going to repair the frontier roads, garrisons, etc.? Now, in World War I, when they had to send labor overseas, and given the fact that there was a lot of campaigning against the sending of indentured labor, so they were given the more politically correct name of Labor and Porter Corps rather than Coolie Corps. Now, this time they were actually, as I said, a proper military frame was put over them. they were enrolled under the Indian Army Act. But as you suggest, they still occupied a marginal place in the military establishment. For example, initially to attract laborers, they gave them a pension, but pretty soon they replaced the pension with a gratuity, which was really unfair because you could lose your life. And if you lost your life on the way to the theater of war, you got 150 rupees as gratuity. If you lost your life on the theater, once you'd reached there, you got 300 rupees. So that was the worth of the life of a laborer in the Labor and Porter Corps.
And that is really sad. And along with the fact that, of course, you have the Indian Porter and the Labor Corps, in 1916, about 16K prisoners were enrolled into what is known as the Jail Porter Corps. Now, these were prisoners. Did these prisoners have, when it comes to use of prisoners, the Chinese exploit the prisoners in their jails for doing a lot of work, a lot of construction work, especially in laying of defense infrastructure. So when in 1916, when the British, created this Jail Porter Corps, Radhika, was it a choice or it was something that was forced upon the prisoners, the Indian prisoners?
In 1916, there was a crisis in Mesopotamia. You're a military historian, so you know there was the siege of Kut, and to the surrender of British and Indian troops to the Turkish forces at the siege of Kut. Now, the infrastructure, therefore, of the British military occupation of Iraq had to be rebuilt, and they needed Indian labor for that. You had to lay roads and railways, irrigation channels, etc. So they were frantic. There were these frantic telegrams which began to pour in from the high command at Mesopotamia to Delhi. Now, at that point, people in India were not willing to go because they'd heard that labor was being demanded there to bury the dead. They'd heard about the reverses in Mesopotamia. So to overcome the bottleneck in labor supply, the government of India thought of tapping both criminal tribe settlements as well as jails. Now, quite a large number, as you pointed out, were in fact sent to Mesopotamia in the Jail Labor and Porter Corps. They made it a kind of experiment in reform, that these men would be allowed, if they served there, they would be allowed to earn an earlier remission. So they kind of made it a kind of sort of as though they had positioned themselves in a global penological reform enterprise. Now, we don't know how many went willingly and how many went unwillingly. Certainly, some thought that they would be able to cut short their jail sentence and that they would have a freer atmosphere in Mesopotamia. But some, one doesn't understand why people with just 2 months left to serve in jail would go when they would be earning much less and conditions of discipline would be much harsher than for other laborers.
Ma'am, you've mentioned this in your book, of course, that these jail porter corps were also the more exploited ones.
Yes, that was actually a terrible story because these are the corps, ironically, for whom we have the most documentation. We barely have any documentation for the free labor corps. But the person who took them was interested in highlighting it as a measure of penological reform. But, for example, the statistics which came in were terribly embarrassing because it was a regime of very harsh and continuous floggings and beatings. There were some horrible stories of people who tried to desert. They deserted not because they were jail laborers who wanted to be free. They deserted because the amount of work they were being, it was almost the only option to get some rest, really. And so that they tried to make their way back to Persia, landed up, many of them were found starving, died over there or brought back, but some did make their escape and were never, heard of again.
Doesn't this tantamount to slavery? The fact that the people, these laborers, Indian laborers, had to run away to get some kind of rest. Doesn't this tantamount to slavery kind of a system?
It was a form. Actually, World War I is very interesting because what you're doing is you're using certain forms of labor servitude, but the incentive you're offering is emancipation from them. So you're tapping jails and you're saying that, at the end of your service, you'll have a remission of sentence. You're tapping criminal tribe settlements and you're telling them when you go back, we'll relax police controls over you. You're using systems of forced labor. For example, in Northeast India, you're using the system of labor tax, and you're telling people that after you have served in the army, when you come back, we will emancipate you from this obligatory labor tax. So you have this peculiar comparison. But World War One did lead, because of manpower hunger, the world over, World War One led to the intensification of certain forms of servitude. We all know about prisoner of war labor and how it was used more harshly in some contexts and less harshly in other contexts. And of course, people in occupied territories were also being used in labor camps, etc.
Ma'am, this book, that is the Coolie was great. The Coolie's Great War also talks about the fact that, while 500,000 Indians were taken abroad as part of the labor force, the women also did play a certain role, in the sense that, back in India, you mentioned about the cases of Jat women objecting to their men being recruited, but a certain section of women did not really object to the recruitment of their men into this.
That's a very interesting question you asked, and I wish I had worked a bit more on that. But that would have taken, if this was difficult, handling that would have been even more difficult, because generally the emphasis has been just on widows, war widows, whereas a whole lot of women, of course, in the family would be affected, the mothers, the daughters, etc. Now, in India, actually, you're very right. They were able to tap peasant communities where men could be taken away because women worked in the field. So India had her own land girls as well. Now, what is interesting is that the commissioner of Delhi, Haley, the Haley Road, etc., he was the commissioner. And he pointed out, he said the Jat women are objecting not only because their husbands and sons are being taken. Of course, they were. Sometimes women followed recruiting parties for miles, crying and weeping and asking for their sons and husbands to be returned to them. But women were also objecting because the work on them intensified. We find petitions from Gurkha women in Nepal saying there's nobody to collect fuel or water because agricultural work is terribly intensive. You take away young men, the burden is going to fall on women. But what I want to say is that because we haven't written about labor within India, we have ignored the material contribution of women working in farms, in mines, in tea plantations to the war. Now, that contribution really became evident in 1917 to 18 when there was a silver crisis and the government began to find it difficult to produce the silver rupee.
Yeah.
What they were worried about was that if there wasn't silver for the silver rupee, people would stop bringing people, meaning men and women would stop bringing their produce and their services to the market. Now, that was the point in which the central role of India in the war really came out. I mean, the people in Delhi were talking in cataclysmic visions about what would happen if you didn't have silver to coin rupees for this produce and for these labor services within India.
You've spoken about the role that the women play, and this book also mentions a quote by a 14-year-old Parsi girl, and she says, and she seems to, this 14-year-old girl, very young girl, she seems to be satisfied with what has happened, saying that women have proved that they could do all the work of a man and fight too. So there was this aspect of this whole social change that was happening.
That's a very interesting comment. I'm so glad, Snehesh, that you picked up on these things because these were things I regretfully did not follow further. Now, what is very interesting is that a whole lot of young women in India, educated and so-called illiterate, heard stories about the new kinds of work which women were doing in the West. So you find it, for example, women in Garhwal, which became a very important recruiting center. The young school girls are conducting parades themselves because they've heard around about women being recruited to the army. Now, this Dinu Bastawala, I've forgotten, she's the granddaughter or niece of some very famous Parsi. She writes this book at the age of 14. And in fact, it's a very bloodthirsty book because it's full of all kinds of bloodthirsty sentiments about Now is the time for an eye for an eye, So this 14-year-old is ready to give the Germans what for. And she's very inspired by this. And what is very interesting is that while in India, there's a whole lot of newspapers have very, very misogynist things to say about the suffragette movement, but they're all very admiring of the roles women play in the war. And the soldiers who go to France, they are also very, very admiring of the women, the role which women play in the war. And sometimes they're writing letters home to their wives who are working very hard, of course, on the family farm, and saying, why are you constantly complaining? Look at these women here. Sort of, they're carrying on uncomplainingly. So
that's very true. And ma'am, whenever we think of the World War One, the people who've been sent in, as you rightly mentioned, we think of the Punjab, the Punjabis, the Sikhs. You of course then you have the Gorkhas, the fighting class. But your book says that the focus on non-combatants actually corrects too much of this Punjab-centered narrative. So besides Punjab, so what do you mean by corrects too much of Punjab-centered narrative? What are the other, from states and players that contributed to the World War One?
I come from UP, and I studied in Nainital. So I made a plug for UP. I pointed out that UP, in fact, contributed the largest number of non-combatants for World War One. And I also pointed out that actually from July 1918, that is after the German Spring Offensive, when recruitment had to step up, Punjab was exhausted. So from July 1918, we see actually recruitment in UP, both of combatants and non-combatants, is outstripping Punjab. I'm sure there are going to be a whole lot of Punjab historians are going to jump on me. And also, I want to point out to places like Kumaon, for example, where so many people joined the army. Kumaon also supplied under Jim Corbett. There were two tea planters in Bhimtal, Jim Corbett and Robert Belair, who took two Kumaon labor companies to France. All stories which, when we shift the focus from combatant to non-combatant labor provinces like Bengal, Jharkhand sent labor to France, to Mesopotamia, and later to the northwestern frontier in the Afghan war and Waziristan campaign. And nobody in Jharkhand remembers the story except in some, I think if I were to go further afield than Ranchi, I would probably get some stories.
Bihar too, and incidentally, the West Bengal also contributed a lot in terms of men as non-combatants, or as you say, the coolie or the coolie co, for that matter. Many of them aspire to, immigrate to, let's say, Canada, or let's say immigrate to the US. And this is something that has been visibly very there in high among the Punjabis and among the Keralites. I am from Kerala, and I know for the fact that they also look out for opportunities to go abroad. Interestingly, your book also brings to light that there were a number of Pashtun and Punjabi ex-sepoys who hoped that their assistance to this entire campaign will actually help them to migrate. So this was something that was prevalent then also?
That is right from the 1880s. We find that Punjabis, Pathans, Punjabis, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, as well as Pashtuns, they all hoped that service to empire would help them to migrate to Australia, which they used to refer to as Telia, or to the prosperous Pacific rim of Canada and America. They also migrated to South Africa, where the economy was more diverse. So you had opportunities, in railway laying, etc., in South Africa. But beginning with South Africa, the color bar, beginning with South Africa from 1907, and then with Australia, the color bar began to go up. And so they were disillusioned. And therefore, it is particularly, in this path of migration from Punjab down to Calcutta and across to Southeast Asia, and from Southeast Asia to Canada, the British were always very, very worried about the kind of ideas and ideologies which were flowing along this path of migration. Now, as for Kerala, I'm always asked by people from Kerala, including my students, what was Kerala's role in World War I? Now, where again, I think we need to write a history of the material resources which India supplied, because the entire west coast of India, I have to read the work of an environmental historian called Tucker. But I think the intensification of forest exploitation along the western coast of India to supply wood for railway building in Mesopotamia. Remember, Mesopotamia was a desert. There wasn't any wood. There wasn't any fuel. So all that was, there was massive kind of exploitation of forests in India. And I think, for example, you had tribal groups along the western coast who were being rapidly transformed into forest labor as a result of World War I, because this, you had to keep supplying to timber to these theaters of war. Salonika, Mesopotamia. These were areas where a lot of timber was being taken from Western India, which of course required labor to extract. And of course, the princely states gave enormous amounts of aid. Travancore, Cochin, they were asked to contribute to the war loan. They were asked to contribute to aeroplanes. And, we have this story of great loyalism, but when you go to the archive, you find them trying to hide their jewels, trying to hide their silver coins, because they were terrified about, the British resident coming and not gently and not so gently suggesting that, they contribute.
The fact is that, of course, the combatants and the non-combatants were recruited, based on different caste structures, and, it all depended on who they thought belonged to the warrior class, who didn't. But, this book also mentions that, as the World War One went ahead, and there was an overlap as far as between the recruiting pool of the combatants and the non-combatants. In a way, was it more homogeneous in that way?
It wasn't homogeneous. In fact, the overlap began to increase, and the army had to stop the overlap because there were two things happening. One, follower labor, that is non-combatant labor, was required. So they were able to leverage for better conditions, wages, etc. Now, the question was that, in fact, when it came to the Indian Labour Corps, at that point, when they went to France, they were getting 20 rupees, whereas the soldier, with all his allowances, was getting 18. So you can see that the wage had outstripped that of the Sipahi. So what you see is that many people from Punjab, the northwestern provinces, etc., they preferred going into the Indian Labour Corps, where you had a better chance to come back home alive than to go in a combatant corps. So the army had to issue an order prohibiting recruitment for the Labour Corps from Gurkhas, Punjabis, to put down particular communities. But nevertheless, those communities slipped in. For example, you were not supposed to recruit Garhwalis in the Kumaon Labour Corps, but the Garhwalis came across to Bhimtal and got themselves recruited from, around Nainital, passing themselves off as Kumaonis. So the overlap grew between the base for combatant recruiting and the base for non-combatant recruiting. And that also, became somewhat of a problem. Again, you find that, for example, the Laskars, the seamen from Sylhet, etc., they found it was better to go in the Labour Corps than to go on a ship in World War I.
They used to get the medals in silver, the Britishers who were in France. And Indians got those medals in a lesser metal, that is bronze. So there was a clear distinction even when about the white skin and the so-called brown skin, or as the Britishers then saw, the colored skin. As even when the medals are concerned for the same level of work that both do.
That's a very interesting point you brought out. That is, in France, all the colored laborers who were Indians, Africans from Africa, Egyptians, they all got bronze medals. But what is interesting is that this was done under the Imperial War Command. So far as the Indian Army was concerned, right from about 1905, the regimental followers, the stretcher bearers, the mule drivers, the government of India actually insisted that they get silver medals. So what is interesting is that in the European theatre, Indian labor got bronze medals. In other theatres, the Indian Army had also always had begun to insist from about 1907 to 1908 that even its follower rank should get silver medals just like the sepoy. Because we must remember that empire used to look different from India. We have to think of empire as multi-sided, and the compulsions of the government of India were different from the compulsions at London. So they couldn't afford to. They found that followers were not taking their medals if they were of bronze.
And many actually left it behind.
Many were actually leaving it behind. They were in frontier wars. They wouldn't bother to collect their medals, and they felt that was very bad. And so they kind of made an equivalence between silver and bronze medals. And what is interesting, Snehesh, is that the bronze medals, because many people didn't bother to keep them, they cost more on eBay than some of the silver medals, because they're more hard to get. It's harder to get the bronze medals.
Well, that is an interesting aspect. While we talk about the discrimination as far as the medals were concerned, the discrimination, of course, that is there. But your book also highlights that there was also rampant caste system even among the the followers or the coolie corps. So was that the case? Specific work had to be done by specific people. There were certain castes who refused to do certain cleaning requirements that they were asked to do.
The situation was this, that so far as the laborers or porters were concerned, it wasn't as though they came only from the lower castes or tribals or from prisoners or etc. For example, in UP and Bihar, which are very neglected provinces really for World War I, you had mixed castes. You could have high castes and low castes. The difference was that if you were in a Brahmin regiment, for example, the government would do, the army would provide the infrastructure to ensure that you maintain your caste, your caste norms, etc. They would provide for a Brahmin cook, etc. In the labor corps, the laborers were allowed to make their own arrangements, who would cook. So, for example, a UP labor company, they'd find a couple of Brahmins and make them cook. But when it came to the regimental followers, where you had specific professions like latrine cleaning, the dhobis work, or the leather workers' work, all of which in India was regarded as stigmatized forms of labor, there was a smaller pool because people here, there was less of an overlap because people didn't want to, go into the army for these professions. Now, yet what we find is that in Mesopotamia, for example, when there was a real crisis of getting enough sweepers, sometimes they forced low caste people within the labor corps or who had come among the stretcher, or who had come with the hospital servants, they forced them to clean the latrines. And we have one tragic case, maybe there were more, of a person who commits suicide because he was forced to do that.
Earlier we've spoken about salaries, the payment that was made to, these people who contributed to World War I. And interestingly, the book brings out the fact that the British mule drivers were paid more than the British cavalry troops.
Yeah.
However, the Indian mule drivers got less than the Indian cavalry soldier.
Yeah.
So there is a distinction between. Why is that so, ma'am? In your research,
it was the Indian mule drivers who began to complain about it, because what happened was when they were positioned in different places, they were able to make comparisons between their position and those of others who were doing exactly the same work as them. Now, their British officers who were interested in good morale also began to put forward their case. Now, as a result of these complaints coming in from mule drivers that, we do much more work, we are never given leave, we are on duty all the time. When you get these parcels from, the Red Cross and all, we are again in the last, we're at the end of the line. So because of these complaints and representations from their own officers, in 1917, the mule drivers were given combatant status. That is, till 1916, they were non-combatants, but in 1917, they were combatants, and they then began to get a near equivalence of service benefits with the sepoy. So what you find is kind of changes taking place in the Indian Army. There is a rationalization which is happening.
That change was taking place while the war was still on.
It was taking place while the war was on, and because of manpower shortage, because it was very difficult to get followers, because shipping was so difficult. So what you had was manpower rationalization. That is, you had to ask the Indian soldier to do more of different kinds of work. And for example, they suggested that the latrine cleaners just do the latrines. And they suggested that why not ask Indian soldiers to start helping to clean up the barracks And, if they hold a long-handled broom, perhaps they can be persuaded at least to sweep the courtyard or something. So they asked that British soldiers also do, a more diverse range of works.
Since we're talking about this rationalization and all, of course, you have the labor corps, you have the followers and all, but there was also the civilian servants also, who were not part of the so-called established corps, but they also were, taken with British officers to these fronts. And your book deals with them a lot about the questions that the British system had about how to take care of them, who will be responsible, and these officers who took them, I think they shied away from the responsibility in case if they were caught in a war. If you could care to explain, elaborate on that, ma'am.
So the British soldier was a very expensive commodity in India, and they wished to reserve him for combatant use. They wanted to turn him into a kind of fighting machine, you can say.
Yeah.
So in India, unlike in Britain, officers were not given a British soldier servant. That is, a person who was a combatant but looked after the personal needs of his officer, particularly during combat.
Yeah.
So in India, the officer was given an allowance for a sais, his horse groom, and then he had his valet, his bearer. And in wartime, they would take their bearers with them. And military memoirs are full of stories of how under the most adverse conditions, Himmat Singh or some Dogra guy, from Kasoli or, somebody would, turn up with tea and toast and a chicken curry under the most adverse circumstances. But in fact, the officers started cooking for themselves only, for example, in the siege of Koot, when they wanted to ensure that their meager supplies of food were not pilfered by servants. They actually started to make chapatis themselves, etc. But what happened in World War I was that as these servants began to be taken prisoner of war, or they died from shelling, etc., these officers did not want to have to pay for their families if they were taken prisoner of war, etc. So what the government then did was that these servants also began to be enrolled. They began to be called EPF, enrolled private followers. That is, for the time being, during war, they were paid by the army. And so if they died, or became prisoner of war, they would get a kind of minimal pension.
The families. Yeah.
But the interesting thing also, and here's the point of continuity, you also have the figure of the Indian Batman or orderly. That is a combatant who looks after the personal needs of his officer.
Yes.
And we have the same dialogue as today about whether that service was given out of compulsion or whether it was given out of devotion. And you have some concerns about whether it gave the stamp of menial status to a combatant. So it's interesting that you continue to have those very same dialogues down till today.
Ma'am, you've also, the fact is that so many of Indians did go abroad, nearly 1.4 million. Of course, the Bombay Port Trust details that you mentioned in your book, where the embarkation or the disembarkation of nearly about 1.8 million have taken place. Of course, there were others also, like the Karachi port was there. But how many did eventually come back?
So the Bombay port embarkation figures, there's this lovely war memorial, there's a lamppost on Ballard Estate, which talks about, 1.8 million coming. So, but that is about people who are coming and going. And this is a point I want to make, that many of the non-combatants refuse to join on what are called duration of war agreements. With this very formidable employer like the army, they prefer to go on 1 year or 2 year contracts, see how they liked it or not, come back and then rejoin. So you had people coming and going.
Okay.
But what was the point you made? Yes, how many came back? Now, this is a very interesting question you asked, because even then at the time, there was a controversy about the number of deaths which took place. The figures have varied between 50,000 to about 70,000. And within India, there was a skepticism. People felt that, in fact, many more had died. Now, the point is, it is precisely because of the large number of non-combatants that possibly, and because the largest number went to theaters like Mesopotamia, where the heavy munition fighting was a little less than in France. I mean, you had different kinds of fighting, whereas in France, you had this, very high fatality rate right at the beginning of the war, which was extremely demoralizing. So I think, yes, even if we push up the figures, and that is due to bad record keeping, we'll find that the figures are not as high as we can expect. So there might be people who differ. And this is due A, to the number of non-combatants, B, possibly to the nature of the theater, which they said. But what has not been taken account of, and that is one of the tragedies of war, is the kind of bodies that people came back with. That is, after you had been exposed to malaria in Salonika, what kind of spleen did you come back with? After you had, how many people came back with TB, from exposure to influenza in, crowded trenches and barracks all over? How many people came back with, one was TB, one was malaria. So morbidity rather than death, and the point was that you got compensation only if your body showed the damage very visibly. That is, if you lost an arm or a limb. But how do you estimate the damage which malaria or TB has inflicted on you? And I think there are, I think a lot of people didn't get the pensionary benefits they should have got if medical boards had been more careful, or if they'd had the capacity really to read the body for the signs of war in a different kind of way.
And that is something which is really sad, that those things have not been factored into our calculation of the exact casualties that the Indian took and in the World War One. And you rightly mentioned the fact that the casualty figures are actually less because first because of the theater of war where more were sent, and of course the fact that the non-combatants were really high. So India contributed a whole lot of non-combatants. But thank you, Radhika Singha, for writing this book. And I read through this. It is extremely well-researched book with lots of information. So viewers, if you want to know a different aspect of the World War One, about the role that the non-combatants played, be it from Punjab, or be it from UP, or be it even Assam, this is the book that you should read. Thank you so much, Ms. Radhika Singha, for this book.
Thank you, Snehesh. And I want to say that, the more kind of hard strategy or, military historians like yourself and those in the United Services Institution in Delhi have been very receptive to my work. I expected some sort of dismissal or perhaps outright hostility, but I found a lot of courtesy and hospitality. So I'm
sure, none of the, I would be very surprised if, since you mentioned hostility, whether you would receive any hostility for this book, because this book is a wonderful research that has gone into the whole, a different aspect of the World War One and India's contribution to it. So I'm sure that, this is a book that even, people from the military would like to read, and also people who are interested in military history would like to read. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Snehesh. It's been actually lovely chatting with you. Thank you.